in the final, collapsing days of the Second World War, when the German Reich stood on the brink of extinction and every hour brought its armies closer to total destruction, one battlefield became a symbol of ultimate desperation, chaos, and unimaginable human suffering. It was a place where encircled soldiers, civilians, and remnants of broken divisions fought with every last ounce of strength, not for victory, but for survival. A place where forests became graveyards, rivers turned red, and the last hope of escape meant passing through hell itself. This was the Battle of Halbe, Germany's final bloodbath, a brutal struggle that encapsulated the end of the war in Europe. Hello and welcome to the channel. Today, we step deep into the dying embers of the Second World War to uncover the harrowing story of the Battle of Halbe. To understand its scale, its chaos, and the crushing desperation that defined it, we will move between interior perspectives, what the soldiers felt, feared, and faced, and exterior descriptions of the battlefield, strategy, and collapsing military structures. Through this layered lens, we will explore one of the deadliest and most tragic battles fought on German soil, a catastrophe that unfolded in April 1945 as the Soviet juggernaut closed in on Berlin and the last fragments of the German Ninth Army attempted to break free. As April drew to a close, the German military machine was shattered. The once powerful Eastern Front had disintegrated beyond repair. Berlin lay under heavy assault. Soviet armies surrounded the city from all sides, and the German command structure was falling apart. In the midst of this chaos, the Ninth Army, commanded by General Theodor Buss, found itself trapped in a massive Soviet encirclement southeast of Berlin. The pocket stretched across dense forests, devastated villages, muddy tracks, and the sprawling Spreewald marshlands. The men trapped inside numbered nearly 200 Salazarn soldiers, Hitler Youth, Volkssturm, refugees, wounded, stragglers, and thousands of civilians fleeing westward. Their objective was simple but nearly impossible: break through the Soviet lines at Halbe and reach the 12th Army under General Walther Wenck, who was attempting to advance from the west. Together, they hoped to march toward the Elbe River and surrender to the Western Allies, rather than fall into Soviet hands. Inside the encirclement, fear spread like wildfire. The interior of the German command posts was filled with frantic reports, desperate radio messages, and the grim realization that time was running out. Soldiers gathered around makeshift tables, tracing routes on worn maps, each path marked by the same grim conclusion: heavy Soviet resistance, artillery choke points, and the absence of supply lines. Ammunition was running low, fuel was scarce, and food was almost non-existent. The sound outside was a constant blend of artillery thundering, aircraft engines growling overhead, and the distant cries of civilians pushing forward with carts, bicycles, and bundles of belongings. The forest canopy shook as explosive shells crashed into the ground, tearing apart trees and turning the once peaceful woodland into a wasteland of splintered trunks and smoking craters. Exterior movements showed the grim reality. Soviet forces were tightening their grip. Marshal Zhukov's 1st Belarusian Front and Marshal Konev's 1st Ukrainian Front were closing in, determined not to let the Ninth Army escape. They deployed heavy artillery, Katyusha rocket launchers, armored units, and infantry divisions in a vast coordinated effort to seal the pocket. Rivers such as the Dami and Spree became deadly barriers, heavily guarded by Soviet machine gun nests and mortar teams. Every village, Kassenblatt, Menrakich, Buchholz, Halbe, became a fortress, contested street by street as German forces fought to blast their way through. Inside the German columns, morale fluctuated between fragile hope and crushing despair. Soldiers whispered about Wenck's 12th Army, imagining that reinforcements would soon arrive. Officers shared rumors of a corridor opening somewhere near Belitz or Trebin, but each new day brought only more Soviet pressure. Wounded men lay on the forest floor, bandaged with torn shirts, shivering as cold nights descended. Medics, overwhelmed and underprepared, used their final morphine doses, trying to ease the pain of men whose injuries were beyond saving. Meanwhile, civilians clung to the uniformed men, begging for guidance, for protection, for any sign that their nightmarish journey might end. The first major breakout attempt began with incredible violence. German tanks, including Panthers and Jagdpanzer IVs, revved their engines and pushed through muddy clearings, followed closely by infantry. Artillery officers called for smoke screens, hoping to blind the Soviet gunners, hidden in the forests ahead. The forest floor trembled as tanks surged forward, crushing branches beneath their treads. But Soviet artillery unleashed a devastating barrage. Shells exploded among the German lines, shredding the first waves of infantry and igniting vehicles. Horses, pulling carts of supplies, were blown apart, scattering debris across the path. Whole sections of the forest erupted in flames as white, hot shrapnel tore through the tree line. Inside the German formations, panic spread as Soviet tanks counterattacked. T-34s burst from concealed positions, firing at close range. The Germans responded with Panzerfausts, their desperate shots lighting up the forest with streaks of fire. The crack of rifles, the roar of flamethrowers, the scream of wounded men, it all combined into a symphony of devastation. Yet despite the carnage, groups of German soldiers continued pushing forward, stumbling over roots, ducking behind burning wreckage, and dragging their wounded comrades through the mud. Exterior reports from the Soviet side describe how the battlefield became a nightmare of entangled bodies, shattered equipment, and devastated landscapes. The forest around Halbe transformed into a labyrinth of death. Soviet commanders ordered their men to use the terrain to their advantage, digging trenches behind trees, building barricades in village streets, and positioning anti-tank guns near narrow pathways. The result was a gauntlet of destruction, through which the Ninth Army had to pass. Inside the German pocket, as days turned into nights, the suffering only intensified. Water sources were contaminated by bodies, forcing soldiers to drink from puddles or melted rainwater. Civilians walked barefoot through ash-covered paths, carrying infants wrapped in blankets torn from abandoned houses. Every explosion shook the earth beneath their feet. Every burst a machine gunfire sent them sprawling to the ground in terror. The cries of children mixed with the metallic clatter of weapons being reloaded, forming an unsettling soundtrack to the desperate march. As the surviving units approached Halbe, the fighting reached unimaginable levels of brutality. Halbe itself, once a quiet village surrounded by forests, became the epicenter of destruction. Exterior descriptions paint the village as a burning ruin, filled with collapsed houses, overturned carts, and shattered church walls. The cemetery became a front line. German soldiers took cover behind tombstones, firing at Soviet troops advancing through the smoke. Artillery shells tore open graves, scattering debris and remains across the battlefield. Soviet infantry stormed the ruins, their silhouettes flickering against the flames as close quarter fighting erupted inside houses, barns, and cellars. Inside the hellish center of Halbe, soldiers experienced combat at arm's length. Grenades rolled across floors as men scrambled behind overturned furniture. Bayonets clashed in narrow hallways. Tank shells blasted through walls, sending clouds of dust and splinters into the air. Wounded soldiers lay in dark corners, whispering for water or calling out for missing comrades. Medics were unable to keep up with the waves of casualties, and many wounded were left behind as the German columns continued their desperate push. By now, the Ninth Army was fractured into smaller groups, each fighting its own miniature war. Some attempted to cross the Spree River, only to be cut down by Soviet machine gun fire. Others tried to bypass Halbe entirely and take forest trails, but these paths were mined, ambushed, or blocked by fallen trees. Many soldiers marched in complete silence, exhausted beyond emotion, moving like ghosts through the burning landscape. They carried little ammunition, sometimes only a pistol with a few rounds. Hunger gnawed at their stomachs. Thirst cracked their lips. Sleep became impossible, as every moment brought new danger. Exterior movements show that Soviet units encircled the breakout points repeatedly, forming ring after ring of defensive positions. Even when some German groups managed to break through the first line, they found themselves facing fresh Soviet units beyond it. The forest floor was littered with abandoned equipment, blown-out vehicles, charred bodies, and the remnants of shattered formations. Trees burned for days, casting eerie glows across the night skies. Inside the 9th Army Command remnants, chaos reigned. Officers struggled to maintain discipline as their forces were carved apart. Communications broke down completely. Orders arrived too late to be followed. Units that once consisted of thousands were reduced to mere handfuls of men. Yet amid the devastation, some soldiers displayed remarkable determination. They carried wounded comrades on their backs. They fought rearguard actions to hold off Soviet advances. They formed small ad hoc groups, combining infantry, tank crews, engineers, and even unarmed civilians in a desperate march toward the west. The final breakouts occurred with extreme violence. By late April, several thousand managed to reach the lines of the German 12th Army, but the cost was catastrophic. Estimates suggest that tens of thousands died in the forests around Halbe. Civilians who had joined the German columns were caught in the crossfire. Their bodies scattered along the paths of retreat. The forests became mass graves, many of which remain marked only by simple memorial stones today. Exterior evaluations conducted after the battle show the incredible destruction left behind. The woods around Halbe were filled with wrecked armor, deep craters, and unmarked graves. The battle is considered one of the deadliest encirclement breakouts in modern history, a final horrific chapter in a war already defined by unimaginable loss. Inside the memory of survivors, the Battle of Halbe remained a nightmare that never fully faded. Those who lit through it described the smell of burning pine, the echo of artillery, the terror of ambushes in the dark, and the overwhelming sense of hopelessness. Many recalled seeing entire families lying motionless along the forest roads. Others remembered comrades who sacrificed themselves to cover the retreat of their units. The human cost was staggering, and the psychological scars endured long after the war ended. This final bloodbath symbolized the collapse of Nazi Germany. It was a battle fought not for victory, but for escape. A battle in which soldiers, civilians, and shattered divisions confronted the full force of the Soviet advance. The Battle of Halbe stands today as a tragic reminder of the devastating consequences of war, the desperation of doomed armies, and the unimaginable suffering endured in the final days of a global conflict that reshaped the world.